In this episode, we'll take a closer look at how children learn to talk in one or more languages at the same time. Although in England it's quite typical for a child to grow up speaking one language only, this is a rather unusual situation if you take a global perspective. It is estimated that worldwide the majority of children grow up speaking two or more languages at the same time. We'll start with monolingual children. How do children acquire one language? What stages do they go through? We've asked Dr. Danielle Matthews from the Department of Psychology at the University of Sheffield.
So children go through many stages in language development, not always in the same order. Basically, children are learning about language from before they're even born. So in the third trimester of pregnancy, they'll be able to hear speech sounds and learn a bit about the prosody of their language, the melody, if you like. Even some new studies are showing that by 6 months of age, some babies have an idea of word forms being associated with different meanings or rather pictures that represent a word form they can match with the sound of a word very, very early on. So we know they're learning a lot in the first year, and towards their first birthday they start to be able to actively communicate with other people. So they've started babbling, but then they might be able to use that vocalization and gestures like pointing to communicate with other people, so they know that they can use that to direct somebody else's attention to something external in the world. So that's quite a big step forward. They get the idea of communication. Very quickly after that they learn that they can use words to do that job. So they've broken into conventional language then, and over the second year of life, so from 1 year to 2 years, they're really building up their vocabulary. After a while they'll be able to start putting words together, and then they break into grammar, which obviously is what gives language its amazing expressive power. So they can put different words together to mean different things. So we might say, for example, that John loves Mary means something different to Mary loves John, because the word order is like a second order symbol, if you like. It tells us something about the meaning of the sentence beyond just the words, and children start to crack into that and use grammar to express all sorts of different complicated meanings. And so the rest of development is about learning all the different types of structures that we can use to mean all the different types of things, and learning how to use them appropriately given the person we're talking to and the context that we're in. That will be more the pragmatic side of things. I use different types of language according to what somebody else knows about, use different registers, so I learn how to be polite or friendly with a baby, or different kinds of registers, adapting my speech to the context. And as children get even older, they will learn skills, for example, how to produce narratives, so long pieces of language talking about something that's not in the here and now, so we can use language to talk about something that happened yesterday, or a fictional world, for example. So we start to be able to construct whole alternative realities, if you like, through language. So this is an extremely protracted process, obviously, but those are some of the steps along the way.
It's simply amazing that children manage to acquire a highly complex and abstract communication system in only a few years' time. Certain factors seem to make this process easier for them, such as joint attention and face-to-face interaction with caregivers. Reading books with kids is hugely beneficial as well. The absence of one or more of these factors seems to have a negative influence on the child's linguistic development.
Well, there are lots of factors that are important for language development, because after all it's sort of a pinnacle achievement of human cognition. We draw on lots and lots of resources in order to be able to use language. So we have our basic perceptual resources. Obviously we need to be able to hear and to be able to produce speech and vision if we're using sign language. We draw on our cognitive resources so that we can learn and remember lots of different word forms, because after all language is made up of somewhat arbitrary signs, and we just have to remember lots and lots of them and be able to break down the speech stream that's very, very rapid, build up structures, grammatical structures from that, so that requires a lot of cognitive resource. We also have to have social motivation and social skills for interacting with other people. And when we study what affects the underpinnings of all of those factors, if you like, it's traditional to look at biological factors, so genetics, if you like, and socialisation factors, but it becomes obvious as soon as you start to think about that these two things are deeply intertwined. So if you're for some reason genetically predisposed not to want to interact with people very much, then you're going to shape your environment, so the way in which you experience the social world is going to be very different. So those socialisation factors are going to play out differently as a consequence. Face-to-face interaction with babies is quite important for language learning for a number of reasons. The first is that babies just like being in face-to-face interaction, and what tends to happen quite naturally is that the baby does something and the caregiver responds. The baby responds to that, and you get this very basic turn-taking really from quite early on in development, and babies find that enormously rewarding. So there are studies showing that babies whose vocalisations are responded to frequently tend to go on to vocalise more themselves, and obviously then they're getting vocal practice, which will then help them to be able to produce words. So joint attention is when two people are attending to some third thing, an object or an event, and both of the people are aware that they're both attending to it, so they're mutually aware. So we have this triangle, if you like, the two people and the object, and we know that we're all together in this. And it's been shown over a number of studies that being in this joint attentional state is really great for word learning and language learning in general. And it seems like joint attention really adds something. It's not entirely obvious right now what that something is. There's a few possibilities for why this is important, but it seems beyond doubt now that it is quite important that children who spend more time in joint attention, hearing language in joint attention, tend to go on to have larger vocabularies later on. Book reading can be a good way of helping children learn language. It's possible to read books with very young babies. Sometimes that can feel a bit alien to some people. Certainly when I was given a book to read with my young son when he was a baby, I found that a bit surprising, and it wouldn't have been something I would have done naturally had I not been prompted to do it. But once we got into it, actually we started to really enjoy reading and still do read together for pleasure to this day. As to the question of why this helps language development, if you just video parents interacting with their young children, say for 15 minutes, you see very rapidly that as soon as they pick up a book, the number of words that they produce per minute, if you like, just goes through the roof compared to normal play interaction, even though you might be talking a lot during it. One reason that it presumably helps language learning is children just hear more words when they're having a book read to them. But it's not just about quantity, it's about quality too. So often it's presumably helpful for the child to learn words because they can see what these words are being used to mean, because there will be pictures in the book, because they will be in joint attention. And it just is the case that when you read books, you come across all sorts of different things in a way you don't in the natural world. You don't just see zebras walking down the street and things like that. So it can be good for learning words, but it's not just about word learning. Obviously, rhyming books can help you learn about phonology, speech sounds. If we hear cat and bat and pat, we might start learning that you know that these thing that differs between them is the k and the p, and that can help with phonological development, which is important for later reading development. And you can learn also about grammar. So the syntactic structures that you tend to hear in books are sometimes ones that you don't necessarily hear in everyday speech. So books can be very rich from that point of view. Also, we think that they're probably quite helpful for learning about more complex things to do with making inferences. Often, as children get older, you read quite complex texts where you have to draw inferences in order to make sense of the overarching meaning of the text, if you like. You have to create a model of the world that it's describing to you. And that's quite an advanced cognitive skill that's useful in all sorts of domains. And of course, it will help children produce that kind of writing and narrative for themselves, so they can start to be able to produce connected speech. So it's likely that reading helps in all sorts of ways, but it's also only going to help if children enjoy it. So from a professional's point of view, it's always interesting to think about ways that we can make this kind of experience accessible to everyone and something that people can enjoy rather than feel as a hardship.
Linguists and educators have long assumed that we all acquire our language at roughly the same speed and reach comparable levels of competence. This view has come under intense criticism over the past 10 years. Researchers have looked in detail at how well people know their languages. They have counted how many words and structures they produce and how accurately they understand them, and they have found vast individual differences between subjects. This is a really important insight because children with better language skills tend to do better in school, and this translates into more successful professional careers later on. It is therefore very important for us to be able to identify children who might benefit from intervention early on. We've spoken about this with Dr. James Street from Northumbria University.
I think we should start first by saying that I think for most people, for the general public, and there's certainly a lot of linguists subscribe to an idea that language acquisition is fairly uniform and that children go through the same stages and are at the same levels of attainment at the kind of the same age. And that's certainly an idea that's promoted in a lot of introductory textbooks to linguistics, and I think that filters down to the general public. So there's this idea that language acquisition is fairly uniform. However, for linguists and psychologists and educationists who are actually looking at what children actually do, it's widely known that there's actually vast individual differences in both the rate of acquisition and also the patterns of acquisition. And these rates and patterns of acquisition are also related to cognitive variables, like, for example, working memory, as well as experiential variables like socioeconomic status. And unfortunately, the general pattern is that children from lower SES backgrounds tend to lag behind their higher SES peers in language development. And these differences are seen across the language system. So in the phonological system, with learning of lexical items. In fact, the differences in the size of children's vocabularies, for typically developing children at the same age, the differences can be so vast that age is not really a very good predictor of the size of a child's vocabulary. And similarly with syntax, we see in children very large differences in the amount of syntactic constructions that children can both produce and understand. So that variation is there in early language development. We know that early language abilities are a key predictor of later language development, and in turn they're related to educational attainment. And we also know that, unfortunately, children from lower SES backgrounds are disproportionately represented in children who have got poorer language abilities in earlier child development. And of course, if you've got poor language abilities, spoken language abilities, and certainly if you've got poor written language abilities in highly literate cultures like ours, then that has potentially very negative outcomes for individuals, because obviously we depend on language for, in our everyday lives, for our social inclusion, and obviously for our later life chances.
So it's possible to predict individual differences in language ability. So most language skills fall on a continuum, whether we think about the number of words that somebody might know or their ability to engage in a conversation. We can generally come up with a way of measuring it, and then generally these things fall on a normal distribution, if you like, a bell curve, with some people being really amazing, some people really struggling, but most people falling somewhere in between. And as researchers of child language development, we want to predict where on a curve a given child will fall at a moment in time, given what we know about them at this moment in time, and perhaps what we know about them from earlier on in their life. And it's possible to do that. So if you can identify which factors were most important, which ones had the most predictive value, then you can do a couple of things. One, you can say, well, if we know at this age that a child's at risk because they might not be able to do this thing early on, which is predictive of something important later on, we can try to screen children to get early help, but also we can try to, maybe there's something we can do about that early thing to help. So for example, we might be able to give parents advice about interacting with their children if we thought that would be helpful, or we could take all manner of strategies to try and help language development along the way. But obviously it's a big question about when is it a good idea to do any of those things. Sometimes it's best just to leave things to take their course. Of course, another thing we know about language development is it's very variable, and it's not necessarily the case that those children who are struggling at one age will be the children who are struggling at another. There seem, in the early years, some big studies, some done in Australia recently, seem to show a lot of movement. So sometimes children can be struggling at one age, but then they're totally fine 2 years later, and other children who look like they were fine earlier on are struggling later. So it's not as stable as you might think. People often ask if there's anything that you can do to help children learn language, either as a parent or caregiver, or perhaps as an early years educator. And probably the simplest advice is to say, just do whatever comes naturally. If you're aware that you want to help your child learn to talk, then you're probably doing the right thing already. Parents very intuitively get down to their child's level and talk to them in a way that is appropriate for them and that they can easily learn from. So basically always just having a conversation with kids, listening to what they have to say, trying to get a conversation going. It basically largely comes naturally. If a parent was genuinely worried, they should always go to see their GP and take professional advice, because there might be different advice if something was not developing normally. But in most cases, it's common sense prevails really. Talk to your children in ways that you find engaging and that you think that will be stimulating for them, and nature will do the rest.
Now that we know how children acquire one language, let's move on and look at children who acquire more than one language at the same time. Are they at an advantage, or do they encounter more problems? Popular literature does not seem to agree on this. For every newspaper article singing the praise of multilingualism, there is another one listing the downsides or even risks of exposing your child to two languages at the same time. Professor Antonella Sorace from the University of Edinburgh puts these contradictory beliefs in perspective.
The mind of the bilingual may differ from the monolingual mind in different ways, and there is a lot of research on this, although there is also a lot that we still don't know. So, for example, bilingual children have been found to be different from monolinguals in terms of social cognition. For example, they understand that other people can have a different point of view sooner than monolinguals. They've also been found to understand language better, so understand how language works in general, and that makes them better at learning other languages. So if you're bilingual, you learn a third language or a fourth language more easily, but also, in principle, better at understanding how the first language works, or the language of schooling, so English in this country, for example. So that's another area in which bilingual children have been found to be more advanced than monolinguals. There is also a third area, which is the area of attention, what psychologists called executive functions. So that includes the ability to pay focused attention without being distracted by other information, but also the ability to switch from one task to the other. So this is a very open area of research. The research shows that growing up with two languages can be important and can have many effects, not just for language, but also outside the language domain. So we need to understand many of these effects better than we do at the moment. But first of all, there's no doubt that bilingualism doesn't damage children, and that is already, being able to show that is a very big result, given that many people actually think that two languages too soon can compromise development and learning of the main language and so on. We know that's not true. So in addition to that, we know that there are advantages and benefits that, at least in some cases, can give a child a head start in several areas. We have to be careful not to exaggerate the effects of bilingualism. I think, there's definitely some positive effects that can be beneficial for studying in certain areas. But we need to understand better how these effects actually contribute, for example, to logical thinking, learning of mathematics, learning of particular topics and subject areas. There are many people who still believe that having two languages too soon is a burden for the brain, for the young brain. And this is a misconception, because the research shows that the child's brain can handle more than one language, and it doesn't compromise development at all. So there is research that shows that language development in bilingual children is not substantially different from language development in monolingual children, and there is no evidence of delays in language development or indeed in cognitive development, because in some areas of cognitive development, as I was saying before, bilingual children seem to be at an advantage compared to monolinguals.
How does bilingual language acquisition work? Many people will wonder how a child manages to acquire 2 or more languages at the same time, while an adult struggles with even one. Is it ever too late to learn another language?
It's important to start learning a language as early as possible, because the child's brain is much more flexible, because it's still developing, and so it's much more open to learning experiences. There are differences between learning a language as a child and learning a language as an adult, in the sense that learning a language as a child can be easier because the child's brain is more flexible. Adults can learn very well, but probably through different mechanisms. For example, an adult can learn explicitly. An adult can learn by learning the grammatical properties of the language. This is something that a young child can't do and doesn't need to do, as long as a child hears the language and hears enough of the language. The grammar is acquired implicitly, without an effort, without focusing on it. It certainly relates to accents, because the acquisition of accents is not just a cognitive phenomenon. It implies some kind of motor, articulatory restructuring. So it's not just a matter of the brain. There is a physical part of pronouncing words in a native way, and that's probably the reason why most adult second language learners don't acquire a native-like accent. There are other reasons as well, but that's definitely one. If there is a possibility to acquire 2 languages simultaneously, parents should go for that. That's a wonderful opportunity for a child. But if that opportunity is not available, it doesn't mean that it's too late. So learning one language first and then another language during childhood is also very beneficial, and children can reach very, very high levels of proficiency. So I would say that it's never too late to learn a language, and that applies to adults as well. It's very difficult to generalize and provide an answer to the question of when plasticity ends. I think current research actually shows that the brain continues to be plastic and flexible for much longer than anybody thought. I think that multilingualism can certainly contribute to an understanding of other people's cultures, of other people's points of view, of other people's perspectives, and therefore it can contribute to peaceful coexistence and living together in today's society. Certainly, again, we shouldn't exaggerate this, but on the basis of the research that is available, for example, the fact that a bilingual child understands that other people can have a different point of view can have a profound influence on tolerance and understanding that all points of view are legitimate and important. There are 2 things to be said. One is that the current controversy concerns only one aspect of bilingualism, the effects of bilingualism on attention, cognitive control, and executive functions. That is the scope of the controversy. The controversy doesn't relate to the many other aspects of bilingualism that have been studied in linguistics or in cognition. And I think that it's actually normal if you start replicating a study, you're going to find slightly different results or even contradictory results. We need, first of all, to understand that bilingualism is not a black and white phenomenon. It's not either or. It comes in many shapes and colors. So it's more of a continuum variable than a dichotomous either or variable. So first of all, we need to understand that. Second, we need to understand and study different contexts for bilingualism, different types of bilingualism. As I said, different language combinations, different patterns of language use. We still don't know whether the distance between two languages matters, and we need more research on that. So we need to compare children acquiring two similar languages or two very different languages, because the effects could go both ways. So if the two languages are very similar, for example, it might be, might require more of an effort to keep them separate compared to very different languages. But that alone is not the only factor, because it depends on how the languages are heard and used around the child, whether they're separate or not, and what people think about these languages. So we are trying to do, we and many other people around the world are trying to do as much research as possible comparing different types of bilingualism, including bilingualism with different languages.
So with regards to predictions, well, for adults, on a usage-based model of language acquisition, frequency of encounter with particular constructions is important. So the general argument is that the more you encounter a particular construction, the more entrenched that will become, such that if you were to test somebody on processing and interpreting a construction that was decontextualized, so there's no contextual information to help you interpret the sentence, you just have to rely on the grammatical cues. On that account, you would predict that if somebody has more experience with a particular construction, that construction will be more entrenched, and then that will lead to faster and more reliable processing and interpretation. So, for example, we test participants on processing and interpreting the English full passive construction. So, a sentence, for example, like Gabriel was hit by Amos. So that kind of full passive where you have a by phrase, those kind of constructions are very infrequent in everyday spoken English language. And we know this from corpus studies. And when they occur in English, they tend to occur in more formal, written, academic type texts. And so on a usage-based model, we would predict that people who possibly read more formal, written, academic type texts will be faster at processing these kind of constructions, and also they'll interpret them more reliably if you give them a task where they have to say, for example, who is doing what to whom, or answer a true-false question about those kind of sentences. So these are the kind of predictions that we make. And we find that generally the very common pattern is that those speakers who have got more experience of reading and encountering those constructions do process them faster and are significantly more reliable when they interpret them. I think it's difficult to overstate the importance of the frequency information. So if we can show that learners are sensitive to the distributions in the linguistic input, and we do, then that's a very powerful argument for usage-based models, because it suggests that learners are basically recording sort of their occurrences of when they encounter particular constructions.